The morning carried a particular kind of cruelty that only the northern plains could manufacture. Not just cold, but cold with intention. Cold that pressed itself against every inch of exposed skin and searched for weakness, the way a debt collector searches for a soft spot. Clara Mae Whitfield stood on the frozen ruts of the road outside the farmhouse she had lived in for 22 years, holding a carpetbag in one hand and her late husband's hammer in the other, watching the door she had just been pushed through swing shut against the pale November sky. She was 63 years old. The thermometer nailed to the porch post read 14 below zero, and the number meant nothing to her in that moment because the arithmetic of survival had already taken over the part of her brain where feelings used to live. The hammer was a Sargent and Company framing hammer hickory handle, worn smooth at the grip from decades of use, the head stamped with a patent date of 1861. Elias had carried it from Pennsylvania when they first came west, wrapped in oilcloth inside the same trunk that held their marriage certificate and the deed to 40 acres they had planned to work together until they were too old to hold a plow. He had pressed it into her hands the winter before the pneumonia took him, not as a sentimental gesture, but as a practical one. Elias Whitfield had been the least sentimental man Clara had ever loved, and she had loved him completely for exactly that reason. The hammer was a tool. It could drive a nail, or it could split a skull, and it was hers now, and that was the whole meaning of it. Douglas Whitfield had not looked at her when he handed over the eviction notice. He had slid it across the kitchen table the way a man slides a card in a game. He knows he has already won. His eyes fixed somewhere just past her left shoulder and spoken in the measured tone of someone who had rehearsed the speech many times and was relieved to finally be delivering it. He had explained with the patience of a man explaining something to a person he considered simple, that the accumulated debts against the property had been assigned to him through a series of legal instruments she had signed over the previous 4 years. He had explained that the county recorder had processed the final transfer 3 weeks ago. He had explained that he had arranged for her to have until the end of the month to gather her belongings and that he considered this generous. Clara had listened to all of it without speaking. She had learned this particular silence from 40 years of frontier life. The silence of someone who is calculating rather than absorbing, who is already 3 steps ahead of the conversation happening in front of them. She had asked only one question. She had asked whether the instruments she had signed included the section along Hart Creek, the south-facing bank 3 miles west of the settlement that Elias had shown her in the summer of 1869, and said in his plain, unadorned way that if they ever lost everything else, a person could survive on that bank and ask nothing of anyone. Douglas had paused for a fraction of a second before answering that the transfer covered all parcels associated with the property. That fraction of a second was the only thing Clara took with her when she walked out the door. The carpet bag held 2 wool dresses, a pair of heavy work gloves with one thumb worn through a small tin box containing $6.40 in silver, a folded piece of paper on which she had copied out years ago, a passage from a geology pamphlet about subterranean temperature stability at depth, and a daguerreotype of Elias taken in 1865, which she did not look at but would not leave behind. The hammer she carried separately. Some things you carry in a bag, and some things you carry in your hand, and the difference matters even when no one else can see it. She walked north on the frozen road toward the settlement of Morrow Crossing 2 miles distant, and she did not look back at the farmhouse. The cold was extraordinary. It was the kind of cold that makes sound travel differently, that turns the creak of your own joints into something you can hear clearly, that strips away the soft padding of ordinary discomfort and leaves only the hard skeleton of what is real and what is not. Her left hand, the one with the arthritis that had been worsening since the previous winter, ached from the grip of the carpetbag with a deep bone pain that she had learned to breathe through rather than resist. Resisting that kind of pain only made it angrier. You breathed through it, and you kept walking, and eventually it settled into something you could work with. Morrow Crossing in November of 1878 was a settlement of perhaps 300 souls, a grain elevator, 2 general stores, a blacksmith, a lumber yard operated by a man named Heinrich Bauer, who had come from the Rhineland in 1866 and applied German precision to the business of exploiting American desperation, a Catholic church, a dining hall run by a widow named Agnes Norris, and the kind of collective anxiety that accumulates in places where winter is not a season, but an adversary. The people who stayed in Dakota Territory through the winters were not people who had failed to leave. They were people who had decided through various combinations of stubbornness, debt, and genuine love for the brutal openness of the land that they would rather fight the cold than surrender the space. This produced a particular kind of character, capable, wary, and deeply skeptical of anyone who claimed to have found a new way to do an old thing. Agnes Norris had known Clara for 11 years. She had known Elias too, had fed him coffee and cornbread at the counter of her dining hall on the mornings he came into town for supplies, had watched him age from a lean and vigorous man in his late 40s into something quieter and more deliberate in his final years before the pneumonia. When Clara pushed open the door of the dining hall that November morning and stood in the entrance with the carpet bag and the hammer and the specific expression of someone who has just been destroyed and is not yet sure how to arrange their face around it, Agnes Norris set down the coffee pot she was holding and did not say anything for a full 10 seconds. Then she said, "Sit down before you fall down." And that was enough. The dining hall was warm in the specific way of places, heated by a large iron stove, and the bodies of working people, not a gentle warmth, but a functional one, the kind that stopped your hands from shaking and let you think again. Clara sat at the counter and drank the coffee Agnes poured and gave a brief factual account of what had happened with Douglas, leaving out the emotions, because the emotions were not useful information, and Agnes was not a woman who required emotions to understand a situation. Agnes listened with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and when Clara finished, Agnes was quiet for a moment, and then she said what Clara had expected her to say, and perhaps feared not because it was cruel, but because it was reasonable. There was a place, Agnes said carefully, a county poorhouse 12 miles east, where several older women of the territory had found decent accommodation and 3 meals a day through the winter and into the spring. She knew of 2 women Clara's age who had gone there after losing their situations and had found it, if not comfortable, then at least survivable. She said this the way a doctor says something difficult, not without feeling, but with the understanding that feeling is not the same thing as help. Clara wrapped both hands around the coffee cup, the left hand aching, and looked at the steam rising off the surface. She had visited the county poorhouse in the winter of 1874, accompanying Father Clemens when he made his pastoral rounds. She had sat in the common room where 12 elderly people shared 4 blankets in the heat from a single stove that the county funded at a level calculated to prevent lawsuits rather than provide comfort. She had watched a man of perhaps 70 who had once homesteaded 160 acres stare at a wall for 45 minutes without blinking. She had understood then that the poorhouse did not kill people with cold or hunger. It killed them by removing from them the one thing that the body cannot survive, losing the sense that their choices still mattered. A person could endure extraordinary suffering long as they remained the author of their own days. The moment that authorship transferred to someone else, something fundamental extinguished itself, and the rest was just waiting. "I appreciate what you are offering," Clara said, and the words were genuine, not polite. "But I know what happens to people in that place. I've seen it. And I'd rather freeze in a hole I dug myself than sit warm in a chair that belongs to someone else's charity." She set the coffee cup down. "There's a bank along Hart Creek, south-facing about 3 miles west. Elias showed it to me years ago. I'm going to go look at it." Agnes Norris looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a person trying to calculate whether to argue or to accept. She was 48 years old and she had survived 2 decades in Dakota Territory, and she knew better than most that the frontier was not a place that rewarded argument. Sometimes people made their decisions, and the most honest thing you could do was hand them another cup of coffee and make sure they were warm enough to walk where they were going. She gave Clara a second cup and a piece of cornbread wrapped in cloth and said that she could sleep on the flour sacks in the storeroom for as long as she needed while she figured out her next step, and that the offer was open without conditions or opinions attached. That was the last act of uncomplicated kindness Clara received for quite some time. She walked out to Hart Creek on a Sunday afternoon 3 days after arriving in Morrow Crossing. The temperature had risen to a relatively merciful 6 degrees below zero, and the sky was the specific shade of white-gray that meant no new snow for at least another day. She followed the creek bed west, the frozen water beneath her boots opaque and gray-blue, the cottonwoods along the bank stripped bare and casting thin shadows across the snow. The land in winter had a kind of brutal clarity to it. Everything unnecessary had been stripped away, and what remained was pure structure, the bones of the country showing through its skin. She found the bank where Elias had shown her, and she stood in front of it for a long time without moving. It was exactly as she had remembered, and the fact that something had stayed exactly as she remembered it in a decade of change and loss, hit her somewhere behind her sternum with an unexpected force. The bank rose approximately 9 feet from the creek bed, a nearly vertical face of Dakota clay, and glacial till dense and dark and layered with the compressed evidence of 10,000 years of water and pressure and time. The face looked south, which meant it received the maximum available solar radiation in the short winter days, which meant the earth behind it held more warmth than north or east-facing ground. At the base of the bank, a natural erosion channel ran roughly east to west water, had been cutting that groove for decades, which told her two important things. First, that the drainage pattern of the surrounding land directed water away from the base of the bank during snowmelt and rain. Second, that the soil composition was consistent enough to have eroded in an organized pattern rather than the chaotic slumping you saw in unstable ground. She pressed her palm flat against the face of the bank and felt the cold surface of the clay, then pressed harder, feeling the density beneath. Elias had taught her this not as a formal lesson, but as a habit of observation, the kind of thing he did automatically, and she had absorbed by proximity over 40 years. You never assumed ground. You tested it, you asked it questions with your hands, and you listened to what it told you. This ground was telling her it was solid, load-bearing, compressed by glacial action into something closer to manufactured brick than natural soil. She took the hammer from her hand and drove it against the face of the bank at shoulder height, and the sound it made was a dense, unresonant thunk. No hollow pocket, no fracture line, no give. Good. She stood back and looked at the stand of cottonwoods above the bank. Old trees, their root systems extending deep into the ground, which meant additional structural reinforcement for the roofline. She looked at the angle of the winter sun low in the southern sky and traced the path it would take across the face of a structure built into this bank. She looked at the natural drainage channel and followed its path away from the bank and down toward the creek bed. Then she closed her eyes for a moment, and in the particular darkness behind her eyelids, she saw the whole thing not as a plan, but as a fact, the way you sometimes see a thing that already exists and is simply waiting for you to find it. 8 feet deep into the bank, 10 feet wide, a front wall of creekstone mortared with clay and dried grass. Cottonwood poles spanning the opening, treated against rot, covered in overlapping layers of newspaper and dried grass and thick prairie sod. A door on the south face, a small window to catch the winter light. A single iron stove against the back wall, and a drainage channel running the length of the east wall, 8 inches wide and 10 inches deep, to catch any moisture that the compacted clay walls allowed through and carry it out and away. The total cost, if she was careful and resourceful and willing to trade labor for materials where cash was not available, might reach $10. She had $6.40. The difference was not in the mathematics of the frontier insurmountable. She opened her eyes and looked at the bank again, and the bank looked back at her, and an agreement was reached that required no words and no witness. She told Agnes Norris that evening that she had found her location and intended to begin construction within the week. Agnes listened without interrupting, which was a form of respect, and then said what she felt she had to say, that the winter was already nearly here, that the ground would be frozen solid for 6 inches down and possibly more, that even if Clara managed to dig the structure, no one had ever successfully maintained a dugout through a Dakota winter without at least one catastrophic failure of one system or another, and that a woman of 63 alone and without resources attempting a construction project of this scope in November, was, she paused, choosing her word, ambitious to a degree that concerned her deeply. Clara listened to all of this the way she had learned to listen to reasonable objections with full attention, because dismissing them entirely was its own kind of arrogance, and sometimes reasonable people were right. But Agnes had also said nothing that changed the fundamental calculation. Every danger Agnes named was real. Every concern was grounded in genuine frontier experience. And not one of them altered the fact that the poorhouse was still the alternative, and Clara had already decided what she thought of that alternative. "I'll be careful," Clara said, "and I'll be smart, and if I make a mistake, I'll correct it." She paused. "That's all anyone can promise." Agnes gave her 2 extra flour sacks for bedding and said the storeroom was hers as long as she needed it. Heinrich Bauer's lumberyard occupied the east end of Morrow Crossing's main street, a large open yard stacked with pine and cottonwood planks, a covered mill shed, and an office that smelled of sawdust and pipe tobacco, and the specific kind of confidence that accumulates in men who have built things with their hands and believe this gives them authority over all questions involving construction. Bauer himself was 52 broad through the shoulders with a gray-streaked beard trimmed in a precise fashion and pale blue eyes that assessed everything entering his field of vision the way a customs official assesses a suspicious package. He had come to Dakota in 1866 with a young wife who had died of fever in 1870 and a set of carpentry methods that he applied to American lumber with the rigidity of a man who believes that the right way to do something is the way it has always been done. Clara walked into his yard on a Monday morning 9 days after the encounter with Douglas and the door. She asked in the direct manner she had learned was the most efficient approach with men who respected bluntness about the price of 6-penny nails by the pound and what he knew about the rot resistance of cottonwood at subterranean depths. Bauer set down his ledger pencil with the careful deliberateness of a man performing patience. He studied her for a moment, the age showing in her face and hands, the worn gloves, the hammer hanging from her belt loop, and then he gave her the lumberyard version of the speech she had already heard from Agnes, amplified by technical detail and delivered with the authority of a man who had built by his own count 19 structures in the territory and watched several dozen others fail. The cottonwood would rot within 2 years underground, he said. The clay walls would saturate during the spring melt, and the whole structure would collapse inward like a wet paper bag. The moisture problem alone made any subterranean construction in Dakota a fool's project. He had seen it happen. He had personally salvaged usable lumber from 3 collapsed dugouts in the past decade, and he knew exactly what the inside of a failed one looked like. He sold her 50 pounds of 6-penny nails for $6 anyway, because commerce was commerce regardless of his opinions about the purchaser's intelligence. But he made certain before she left the yard that she understood the full weight of his professional assessment. He used the word inadvisable twice and structurally compromised once, and looked at her over the rims of his spectacles in the manner of a man who considers himself to have discharged his moral obligation through the act of warning. Clara thanked him, paid for the nails, and asked if he had any warped or rejected pine boards he would sell at a reduced price. He did a door blank that had cut badly in one corner, which he sold her for $1.20, with the air of a man extending a charity he didn't really feel. She carried the nails in the door blank out of the yard in 2 trips, setting them down and going back because the weight was more than she could carry in one load, and she had stopped being embarrassed about that sort of thing sometime around her 55th birthday. She started digging on the 15th of November. The ground was frozen solid for the first 8 inches, a compacted crust of ice and clay that rang against the tip of her spade like iron. She had borrowed the spade from Agnes, a heavy steel-bladed implement with a cracked ash handle wrapped in leather cord to hold it together, and the first morning she drove it against the frozen bank and felt the shock of impact travel straight up through her wrists and into her left elbow. She understood immediately that direct excavation was not possible. She gathered dead wood from the cottonwood grove above the bank-fallen branches, storm debris, the dry remnants of the previous year's growth, and built a fire directly against the face of the bank at the height and width she had calculated for the entrance of her structure. She fed it steadily for 2 hours, feeding it the way you feed a difficult animal attentively without looking away. When the clay near the fire's base began to show the first signs of thaw, she took the spade and worked fast, carving into the softened earth with everything she had. The window of workable time was perhaps 40 minutes before the cold reasserted itself and the surface stiffened again. She dug until her vision blurred at the edges, which was how her body announced that it had reached its limit. And then she stopped and built another fire and stood in the cold while it worked on the next section, her breath coming in short white clouds, her left hand aching so deeply it had gone past pain into something like an argument she was having with her own skeleton. She worked before dawn in the hours before her morning shift washing dishes at Agnes's dining hall, and she worked again in the late afternoon after the shift ended, walking the 3 miles each way in temperatures that dropped below zero as the November sun collapsed toward the horizon. She averaged perhaps 4 hours of sleep in the 24, which is not enough for a woman of 63 with arthritis and a healing blister on the palm of her right hand where the spade handle had opened the skin on the 3rd day. But the body she had discovered was more flexible about sleep than it was about warmth or calories, and she was keeping herself supplied with both. Agnes noticed the state of her hands on the fifth day, specifically the right palm, which had gone through the full cycle of blister and burst and dried blood and tight new skin, and was working on a second cycle underneath the first. Agnes cleaned it with spirits and wrapped it in clean cloth without comment, and then, while she was wrapping it, said, "I want you to understand that I don't think this is going to work. I want you to understand that I'm going to help you anyway." There is a category of loyalty that does not require agreement, and it is rarer and more valuable than the kind that does. On the eighth day of excavation, something unexpected happened. The rhythm of fire and dig, which had been producing perhaps 14 inches of progress per session, suddenly accelerated. The clay composition changed at the 18-inch depth. The frozen surface crust gave way to a layer of glacially compressed till that was denser than the material above it, but retained heat from the fires more efficiently, thawing faster and holding its softened state longer. She worked that layer like a revelation, pushing 8 inches further in a single session than she had managed in the entire previous 2 days. She stopped when the light failed, sat down in the partial excavation, and felt for the first time since November 15th that the geometry of what she was doing was going to resolve correctly. The back pain had begun on day 3. It was a muscular pain first deep in the lumbar region, the kind that comes from repeated bending and lifting while standing on uneven cold ground, and by day 6 it had settled into something more permanent, a constant low pressure in her lower back that intensified when she straightened from a crouch and eased when she lay flat. She had developed a technique for managing it. She worked in shorter sessions of intense digging, followed by brief periods of lying flat on the frozen ground with her knees bent, which was ungainly and cold and effective. She had also learned to lean into the excavation differently, using her body weight rather than her arm strength for the initial drive of the spade, which put the stress on her legs and back in a more sustainable distribution. She told no one about the back pain, not because she was hiding it, but because mentioning it would generate concern that would consume time and energy she didn't have to spare, and concern was not a structural solution. James Alderton rode past the excavation on a Thursday in late November, heading west toward his property 2 miles upstream. He was 58 years old, a solid and weathered man who had homesteaded his stretch of the creek in 1872 and built it into 80 acres of wheat through the combination of relentless labor and the kind of good fortune that favors people who are already working hard when it arrives. He had lost 3 fingers to frostbite in his first Dakota winter. His right hand showed the absence of the index, middle, and ring fingers, leaving only thumb and pinky in an arrangement that looked perpetually surprised, and he wore this loss not as a badge of experience, but as a scar he would have preferred not to have. He pulled up his horse and looked down into the excavation where Clara was working in the particular focused silence of someone who has no interest in being interrupted. Alderton had known Elias Whitfield by reputation and occasional commerce, and he regarded Clara with the combination of residual respect and fresh skepticism that characterized how most of Morrow Crossing processed the news of Douglas's eviction of her. He asked in the direct way of men who consider themselves practical whether she understood that the temperatures in this territory could sit at 40 below zero for 2 weeks at a stretch, and that no dugout without at minimum double walls and a cast iron stove rated for extreme cold could maintain a survivable interior during a genuine Dakota deep freeze. He explained that he had seen dugouts. He had seen several, and that the ones he had seen were what ignorant settlers built in their first season when they had no resources for a real structure, and that every single one of them was either abandoned or collapsed within 3 years. He said all of this from the back of his horse, with the genuine concern of a man who is trying in his own limited way to prevent an outcome he considers inevitable. Clara listened from inside the excavation 4 feet deep in the bank, by this point her spade resting against the wall beside her. She looked up at Alderton on his horse, at the absent fingers of his right hand, at the expression on his face that was trying to be kind and landing somewhere between condescension and pity. She said, "Mr. Alderton, with respect, the dugouts you've seen failed because the people who built them didn't understand water. They didn't manage drainage, they used green timber for the roof supports, and they didn't control the thermal mass of the surrounding earth. I understand all 3 of those problems, and I know how to address them. I appreciate your concern. She picked up her spade. Alderton sat on his horse for another moment, then tipped his hat and rode on, and Clara could tell from the set of his shoulders that he had already decided she would be dead or hospitalized before February. Father Clemens found her after the Sunday Mass at the end of November. He was 60 years old, a compact and serious man with deep-set eyes and the specific gravity of someone who has spent decades absorbing other people's suffering and has learned to carry it without being crushed by it. He had known Clara for 20 years, had performed Elias's funeral mass in 1871, had watched her manage the farm alone through 7 difficult years with the quiet competence of someone who simply did not consider failure an available option. He regarded her in his private assessment with something close to admiration, which made what he felt compelled to say harder rather than easier. He walked beside her on the frozen road after Mass and spoke carefully. He said, seen too many settlers lose everything through combinations of poor planning and pride, and he worried that what she was proposing placed her in serious danger. He was not questioning her capabilities in ordinary circumstances. But a woman of 63 alone, 3 miles from town in a structure that had not yet proven itself, what happened when she fell ill, as people did in winter. What happened when a storm sealed the entrance for 3 days? He had a family in the settlement, the Harmons, who needed domestic help and would provide a warm room and meals and a wage that would allow her to save towards something more permanent in the spring. He framed this as Christian charity, and he meant it that way sincerely, without malice, with the full weight of his genuine concern for her. Clara walked beside him for a moment after he finished looking at the frozen road ahead. She was not angry. Father Clemens was a good man, and he was wrong, and those two things could exist simultaneously without requiring her to perform any particular emotion about it. She thanked him with the specific warmth she felt toward people who were trying to do right, even when they were doing it incorrectly, and she told him that she respected his concern and that she would take every reasonable precaution and that she had made her decision. Father Clemens looked at her for a long moment with an expression that moved through several things before settling into something she could not quite name, not resignation exactly and not acceptance, but perhaps the early stages of the realization that he was watching something that would teach him whether or not it ended the way he expected it to. She turned back toward the creek road. Her boots were soaked through at the toe, and the late November sky was the gray-white of an ice block held up to a clouded sun. The excavation was now 5.5 feet deep into the bank, 4 feet of the front wall, roughed in the dimensions taking shape around her with the inevitability of something that had always been there, waiting to be revealed. She had 40 cents left in the tin box after the nails and the door blank and a small purchase of pine pitch from the general store. She owed Agnes a week of Saturday labor in exchange for 4 salvaged glass panes that would serve as her window. The linseed oil and tar she needed to treat the roof poles would cost $1.60 that she did not yet have. But there was underneath the pain in her back, in the ache in her left hand, and the persistent cold that lived now in her bones like a tenant who had stopped paying rent, something she had not expected to feel at this stage of her life. It was not happiness exactly, and it was not the reckless confidence of someone who does not understand the risks they are taking. It was something quieter and more durable, the specific satisfaction of a person who has looked at a difficult problem, understood it completely, and begun the work of solving it with the tools available to them. Elias had recognized this quality in her before she recognized it in herself. He had called it her engineering mind, not as a compliment exactly, but as an observation, the way he observed that the south field retained moisture longer than the north, or that cottonwood burned hot but fast. A fact, a useful fact. The excavation took 3 more weeks to complete. The main room reached 8 feet deep into the bank, precisely sloping the dirt floor toward the entrance at the grade she had calculated, 1-inch drop per running foot, so that any water infiltrating from the rear would travel toward the exit rather than pooling against the back wall. The back wall and side walls were cut at a deliberate 10-degree inward angle, leaning toward the center of the room, a geometric decision that distributed the pressure of the earth above along a more stable vector and drastically reduced the cavity's tendency to collapse inward at the corners. Every night before the temperature dropped the ground back below workable, Clara took a heavy flat board, salvaged from a broken packing crate, and spent an hour methodically tamping the walls, pressing the board against the surface and driving it with the heel of the hammer, compressing the clay until it locked together with the glacial till beneath it and produced a surface that rang like fired ceramic when you struck it. She dug the drainage channel along the east wall on a Sunday morning in early December. Working alone in the near dark before sunrise, the lantern Agnes had lent her, throwing a thin yellow light against the clay walls. The channel ran 8 inches wide and 10 inches deep along the entire length of the east wall, from the deepest back corner straight to the front entrance, its bottom sloping fractionally toward the door, gravity doing the work that no pump was required to do. She cut a second intersecting drainage channel outside the front entrance, angling away from the structure and down toward the creek bank, designed to carry snowmelt and rain safely away from the foundation during the violent spring thaws she knew were coming. On the 14th of December, she mixed her first batch of wall mortar. 2 parts dense clay from the creek bank, 1 part dried prairie grass cut and broken into rough half-inch lengths, enough water to make it workable but not wet. She had arrived at these proportions through 3 weeks of small tests, pressing batches against the back wall in thin layers and waiting to see how they cured. The first batch she mixed for the actual construction was too wet. She knew it as she was mixing it, felt the texture wrong under her hands and stopped. She added more clay and more dry grass and worked it again, and still it was off. She could feel in the consistency of it that when it cured, it would be brittle, that the water content was encouraging too much surface tension in the drying process. She covered the batch and left it overnight. The next morning, the cured test patches she had pressed against the wall the previous week told her what she needed to know. 2 of them had developed hairline fractures along the lower edge, the signature of a mixture that had dried too fast from the top, while the base remained damp. She stood in the half-completed front room, looking at those hairline fractures with an expression that Agnes had, she been present, would have recognized as the one Clara wore when she was doing mathematics on something that had not gone as expected. The fractures were not catastrophic. They were instructive. The mixture ratio was right, but the curing conditions were wrong. She was mixing in the cold and the surface was setting before the interior had time to stabilize. The fix was to pack the applied mortar more densely against the base, to work in smaller sections, and to cover the fresh work with dried grass overnight to slow the surface cooling rate. She spent 4 days correcting the approach and testing the revised method before she resumed construction. Those 4 days cost her 80 cents in additional materials and stripped 2 layers of callus from her right palm. But when the revised mortar cured, it cured solid and even and without fracture, and she ran her thumbnail along the surface of it and felt the density underneath that told her it would hold. The reckoning arrived not as a dramatic event, but as a quiet, devastating internal accounting. It was a Thursday evening in mid-December. The excavation complete, the drainage channel dug, the front wall half-built in stone and mortar. The door blank set but not yet hung, and Clara was sitting on the floor of the incomplete dugout, eating the cornbread Agnes had sent with her, and looking at what she had built and what remained to be built, and doing the full accounting of what it had cost and what it would cost and what she had left. The total remaining cash in the tin box was $4.20. She needed $1.60 for linseed oil and tar. She needed $3 for a functional stove, which she had not yet located. That was $4.60 she did not have against $4.20 she did. She sat with that number in the yellow lantern light, the cold pressing against the clay walls of the room she had carved out of the frozen earth, and she felt the full weight of what she had undertaken settle onto her at once, not gradually as it had been accumulating, but all at once, the way a roof loaded with snow will hold and hold and hold and then release its full weight in a single instant. She was 63 years old. She was $4 short. Her back hurt every morning, and her left hand had bad days where she could not fully close it. The stove she needed existed somewhere in the territory, but she had not yet found it. The cottonwood poles for the roof still needed to be felled and debarked and treated. The sod for the roof covering had to be cut and hauled. The window had to be set and sealed. The door had to be hung and insulated. She sat with all of that for perhaps 20 minutes, which is the amount of time she allowed herself to sit with hard things, and then she said to no one, to the clay walls and the lantern and the cold and the particular darkness of a half-built room that was not yet a home, "You don't get to stop." She stood up, feeling the protest in her lower back and the ache in her left hand, and she picked up her spade and went back to work on the front wall. The words were not encouragement. They were simply accurate. The front wall rose another 8 inches that evening before the cold took the mortar's workability away. The stove came from a family named Prescott who were leaving. That was how a significant portion of material goods changed hands in Dakota Territory in the winter of 1878 through the defeat of people who had come west with intentions and discovered that intentions were not sufficient currency for what the land charged. The Prescotts had homesteaded 12 miles south of Morrow Crossing in 1875, built a frame house, broken 40 acres, and lost 2 consecutive wheat harvests to drought and rust before the husband developed a lung condition that the territory's single physician described as incompatible with another Dakota winter. They were packing for Ohio when Clara found them through Agnes, who knew everyone's business because everyone eventually ate at her counter, and people talk when they are warm and fed. The stove was a cast iron model cracked along the left firebox wall in a diagonal line that reduced its efficiency but did not compromise its function, and the Prescotts accepted $3 for it because $3 was what Clara offered, and Ohio was more important than negotiation. Samuel Pratt helped her move it. He was 24 years old, the son of a wheat farmer who had broken his back in a threshing accident the previous summer and spent the autumn recovering in a way that left the family's winter fuel supply critically short. Samuel had appeared at Agnes's dining hall 2 weeks earlier, looking for work, found none, and was sleeping in the livery stable in exchange for mucking stalls when Agnes mentioned him to Clara. He arrived at the Prescott place with a borrowed wagon and the specific physical confidence of a young man who has been doing hard labor since he was old enough to grip a handle, and he lifted his end of the stove with a straightforward ease that made Clara acutely aware of the distance between 24 and 63 measured in the language of load-bearing. She directed the placement from the wagon bed, calling the angles, calculating the balance, and when Samuel set his end down wrong and the stove tilted toward the wagon's left wheel, her correction, sharp, precise, immediate, stopped the whole thing from going over. He looked at her with the recalibrated attention of someone who has just discovered that the person giving directions knows what they are talking about. She told him what she was building on the walk back to Hart Creek. Not as a recruitment speech, but as information, because she had learned that people make better decisions when they have accurate information, and she needed him to understand what the work was before he committed to any of it. She described the drainage channel, the wall angles, the roof, engineering the covered firewood vault she had been considering. She described what remained to be done, 23 cottonwood poles to fell debark and treat the sod, cutting and hauling for the roof, the window installation, the final courses of the front wall. She described her physical limitations without apology or performance, specifically the back and the left hand, and she described the rate at which the work was progressing and the rate at which winter was progressing and what the gap between those two rates meant. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Then, I don't have anything to trade you except work. He paused. But I can work. She considered him. He was not asking for payment, and she could not have provided it. He was offering an exchange of labor for knowledge, though he had not framed it that way, and she suspected he did not yet fully understand that this was what was happening. She told him to come back the next morning with an axe and a draw knife if he could find one, and that she would feed him the cornbread she got from Agnes and teach him everything she was doing as she did it. He showed up before dawn with a borrowed axe, a draw knife, with a loose handle he had retightened with a new wooden wedge, and the remnants of a cold biscuit he had saved from the livery owner's kitchen, which he ate on the walkout and arrived without. She noticed that he was embarrassed about this, and she did not acknowledge it, because embarrassment is a luxury that cold weather cannot afford to maintain. The cottonwood felling took 4 days. Clara selected the trees with a specific criteria. Her calculation required diameter no less than 7 inches at chest height, no less than 14 feet of usable straight trunk above the root flare, no significant rot visible at the base. She walked the grove above the bank and marked 26 trees with a chalk line, 3 more than she needed to account for those that would prove flawed once opened. Samuel swung the axe and she directed the fall angle, calling the notch direction based on where the trunk needed to land for easiest handling. 3 of the 26 showed soft centers when opened, the rot that Bauer had warned about, though Bauer had claimed it was universal, and it was not. Those 3 were set aside for firewood. 23 poles lay clean and sound in the snow beside the bank. She had borrowed the draw knife. Debarking each pole was roughly 40 minutes of continuous pulling long strips of bark peeling away from the green wood beneath the pale inner surface, emerging wet and smooth, and smelling of the particular greenwood smell that is somewhere between plant and lumber, not yet one thing or the other. Clara worked the upper sections of each pole where Samuel's height gave him a reach advantage. She worked the lower sections herself, kneeling in the snow, with the draw knife angled just so, pulling toward her body in the motion her husband had taught her, and that her arms still remembered even when her hands were stiff. The bare poles stacked white against the gray-brown creek bank like the clean bones of something enormous. The linseed oil and tar came from Bauer's hardware section, $1.60, as she had calculated paid, with the last of the tin box money, and leaving her with exactly nothing. She mixed the two in a salvaged metal pail, heating it over a small fire until it liquefied into a dark penetrating compound that she and Samuel applied to every surface of every pole with rags wrapped around sticks, not painting it on, but pressing it into the grain, working it into every pore of the bare wood until the surface darkened uniformly. The smell was sharp and chemical and satisfying in the way of things that are doing their job at a molecular level. Each treated pole was set aside on forked branch supports to cure without touching the ground. And while they cured, she and Samuel laid the roof support structure across the opening, spacing the poles precisely 8 inches apart, spanning from the compacted clay of the back wall to the creekstone courses of the front. The newspaper accumulation had been ongoing since late October. Agnes had saved her every paper that came through the dining hall, a weekly that arrived in irregular bundles, a farm gazette that a traveling merchant left behind, a church circular printed on heavy stock. Clara had also solicited donations from both general stores, explaining only that she needed paper for insulation, and the storekeepers had given her their packing sheets and wrapping paper without questions or opinions, which was either indifference or a form of tact she did not stop to analyze. The stack, when she laid it out in the dugout, came to nearly 3 feet, compressed thousands of overlapping pages of print that had recorded the events and opinions and advertisements of a world that was from the perspective of a woman lying awake in a half-built hole in a frozen creek bank, remarkably concerned with things that were not survival. She laid the sheets across the roof poles in overlapping courses, each sheet lapping the one below it by 6 inches on the downhill side, working from back to front, the way you shingle a roof so that any water penetrating the sod above would hit paper and travel forward and outward rather than finding a gap to fall through. Samuel held the sheets against the poles in the wind while she pressed and overlapped, and the work had the concentrated attention of surgery, every placement deliberate, every overlap checked twice, because a gap in this layer would not announce itself until the first heavy rain, by which point correction would require removing everything above it. Over the paper went a dense mat of dried prairie grass that she and Samuel had spent 3 days cutting and hauling from the flats south of the creek, working with borrowed scythes in the gray November light, bundling the grass and carrying it on their backs in loads that left deep furrows in the snow. Then the sod nearly broke her. Each piece cut 3 feet long, 12 inches wide, 4 inches deep, sliced from the thickest root mat she could find where the prairie grass had been binding soil for decades. She cut each piece herself because the angle of the spade and the pressure required to sever the root mass without crumbling. The block demanded a precision she did not yet trust Samuel with, and a crumbling sod block on a roof was worse than no sod at all. Each block weighed between 28 and 32 pounds wet, and she hauled them on a plank sled to the base of the bank, and Samuel carried them up. She cut, he hauled. The system worked until the afternoon of the 3rd day of sod cutting, when she straightened from a crouch and the pain in her lower back stopped being something she could breathe through and became something that sat her down in the snow involuntarily, her legs simply ceasing to cooperate with the instruction to remain upright. She sat in the snow for perhaps 4 minutes. The cold came through her wool skirt immediately, and the pain in her back was a column of fire from the base of her spine to her shoulder blades. Samuel was up on the roof and could not see her, which was the one thing about the situation she was grateful for. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth slowly, the way you breathe when you are managing something that does not respond to force. Then she got up. It took 3 attempts, and she used the spade as a crutch for the first one and the second, and she was standing on the third, and she cut the next sod block from her knees instead of from a crouch, which was slower but sustainable, and she did not stop again that day. The roof was finished on the 28th of December. Two alternating layers of sod, each piece laid perpendicular to the one below, so that no joint aligned between layers and the whole mass locked together under its own weight into something that could hold a man standing on it without deflection. She climbed up and stood on it herself, testing bouncing once on her heels, feeling the solidity beneath. The cottonwood poles below did not flex. The paper and grass layers did not compress visibly. The sod held the way the earth held, with the patient total indifference of something that has been doing its job for longer than the people watching it have been alive. Clara moved into the dugout on the 1st of December as planned, dragging the carpet bag and the cast iron stove and a rope bed frame that Samuel had helped her construct from salvaged lumber in a single evening. The interior dimensions were as calculated: 8 feet deep, 10 feet wide, 9 feet long, the ceiling rising from just over 6 feet at the rear wall to 7.5 at the front. The light from the 4 salvaged glass panes set in the south-facing window frame was thin and slanted, and exactly enough to work by during the short December days. She had sealed the window with her clay grass mortar and pine pitch pressed into every joint until the glass sat in its frame as airtight as she could make it. The door blank hung on heavy strap hinges, purchased from Bauer, on credit against her future labor, an arrangement that had cost her a careful conversation and a demonstration of the mortar compound's cured strength that she pressed a sample of against his workbench and invited him to try to crumble, swung clean, and sealed its frame on all 4 sides. The first night she slept in the structure, the outside temperature dropped to 38 below zero. She woke at 4 in the morning and lay still in the darkness, listening. What she heard was nothing, not the wind which was audible outside but arrived at the sod roof as a muffled, distant friction, not the creak of frame lumber contracting in the cold that she had listened to for 22 years in the farmhouse, not the particular desperate sound of a structure fighting a temperature it was not designed to handle. The interior air measured against the back of her hand the way you measure a child's fever registered somewhere around 54 degrees without the stove having been lit since the previous evening. The thermal mass of 8 feet of Dakota earth on 3 sides and overhead was doing exactly what physics required it to do, absorbing the previous day's solar input and releasing it slowly, steadily, without drama or mechanical assistance, at a rate that kept the interior of a hole in the ground warmer than most of the frame houses in Morrow Crossing on the worst night of the month. She lit the stove at first light, and by mid-morning, the interior had reached 66 degrees. She opened the door briefly to check the outside temperature. The moisture in her breath froze before it had traveled 6 inches from her face, which put the exterior air somewhere below -20. And then she closed the door and sat at her scrap lumber table with a cup of coffee and felt the specific texture of being exactly right about something that everyone around her had believed you were wrong about. It was not triumphant. It was quieter than triumph. It was the satisfaction of having argued with physics and discovered that physics had agreed with you all along. The firewood problem announced itself on the 18th of January. She had spent all of October and November accumulating the fuel supply, working with Samuel to cut dead cottonwood and elm and ash from the creek groves, sectioning it into stove lengths, splitting it and stacking it 6 feet high and 8 feet wide just outside the dugout entrance, under a canvas tarp she had purchased from Bauer for $1.40. The wood was well seasoned. She had been selective about what she cut, taking only the driest standing dead and the oldest fall timber, rejecting anything that showed green in the split face. The stack represented what she had calculated as a 12-week fuel reserve, which would carry her through the worst of the winter with a margin. On the night of the 17th, 2 inches of snow fell and melted partially during a brief temperature rise the following afternoon, soaking the canvas tarp through in a way that waterproofing could not have prevented because the snow had worked under the edges. When the temperature dropped again after dark, the outer 4 inches of the wood pile froze into a single interlocked mass, not individual pieces of firewood, but a solid construction of ice and bark and split wood face that required a hatchet to break apart. She worked at it by lantern light, chipping pieces free, and what came free came wet and half frozen, and when she loaded it into the stove, it produced exactly what wet wood always produces: thick, acrid smoke that filled the dugout before the draft could clear it, a fire that required 3 times the normal tending to maintain, and roughly half the heat output of properly dry fuel. She went to bed that night with the interior temperature at 51 degrees and the smell of smoke in her hair, and the precise calculation of how many days she could sustain this rate of inefficiency before her reserve ran out ahead of winter's end. She tried to reorganize the stack the following morning, pulling the frozen outer layer apart and moving the drier interior pieces to a position she could reach without fighting through ice. The temperature was -12. Her left hand inside its wool glove had gone past aching into a frightening numbness within 15 minutes of working at the frozen pile, and she had to stop and go back inside and hold her hand against the stove casing until the feeling returned, a process that took 11 minutes and produced sensations she preferred not to think about carefully. She went back out. The stack was not cooperating. The individual pieces that she freed from the frozen outer mass were wet and cold and heavy, and she had to carry them inside and lay them near the stove to dry, which consumed floor space and created a persistent fire risk and solved tomorrow's problem while failing to address the problem of tonight. She sat at her table that evening with the stove working hard on wet wood and the interior temperature hovering at 58 degrees and the lantern throwing its yellow circle against the clay walls. And she looked at the drainage channel running along the east wall, empty and dark. And she sat with what she was seeing for a long time before she let herself see it completely. The channel was 9 feet long, 8 inches wide, 10 inches deep. It ran from the deepest back corner of the dugout straight to the front entrance. It was for the next 12 weeks of frozen winter, performing no hydraulic function whatsoever. The subterranean temperature at this depth kept the surrounding earth dry, and the channel's drainage purpose would not be relevant again until the spring melt in March. It was until that point 9 feet of precisely engineered empty space built into her floor. She looked at it for a long time. Then she got up and measured it with a length of cord she kept for the purpose, confirming what she already knew. Then she sat back down and worked out the geometry of a wooden cover in sections, each section 2 feet long, constructed from pine boards narrow enough to bridge the channel and be lifted individually to access the space below. She worked out the ceiling clay grass mortar at the joints where the wood met the earth walls to prevent air infiltration from below. She worked out the convection, a small strategic opening cut in the board cover at the back corner near the stove precisely sized to draft the heat downward into the channel and circulate it along the stored wood and back up into the living space. The opening could not be too large, and it would create a draw that upset the stove's combustion. It could not be too small, and the circulation would be insufficient to drive meaningful moisture out of the stored wood. She calculated the cross-section needed based on the stove's output and the channel volume and the approximate moisture content of the wood she was dealing with, working through the arithmetic twice to confirm it. She was at Bauer's yard when it opened the following morning. 8 feet of 1x12 pine ripped to 3-inch widths at 80 cents for the full order. Bauer ripped the boards himself on his mill saw, looking at her over the machine with the expression of a man who has given up trying to predict what a particular customer is going to ask for next. She was back at the dugout within the hour and spent the rest of the morning fitting the pine sections to the channel, each 2-foot panel custom fitted to the irregular earthen walls, pressing her clay grass mortar into every gap where wood met dirt and tamping it smooth. By early afternoon, the channel was covered, and she was walking on it. The boards held her weight without deflection, the surface level with the surrounding floor, the whole installation invisible unless you knew to look for the thin lines between sections. She cut the convection opening in the back corner panel with a chisel 1 inch wide, 3 inches long, oriented to face the stove. She loaded the exposed channel sections near the door with split wood from the wet pile outside, dropping the pieces down through the open back panels before fitting the covers back in place. She sealed the remaining joints. She fired the stove. The first indication that the system was working came 40 minutes later. She pressed her palm flat against the board cover 6 inches from the stove and felt warmth coming through the pine, not conducted warmth from the floor above, but rising warmth, the specific thermal signature of air that had been heated and was moving. She lifted the cover section nearest the door and placed her hand over the opening and felt the air coming up warmer than the ambient room temperature, carrying with it the faint, dry smell of wood releasing its moisture in a controlled, gradual evaporation, rather than the violent steam of wet wood in a fire. She replaced the cover and sat down on it and put her hands in her lap and understood what she had built. The drainage channel she had dug in October to prevent flooding was from this moment until the spring thaw a subterranean kiln. The stove's waste heat, instead of rising directly to the ceiling and escaping when the door opened, was being drafted downward through the convection opening, traveling the length of the channel through the stored wood, drying it as it went, and returning to the room warmed rather than wasted. She was burning dry wood to dry wet wood, and the dried wood would burn cleaner and hotter than the wet wood had, and the efficiency gain would compound itself forward through the winter. But she had cut the convection opening too large. She discovered this at 10 o'clock that night, when the stove's combustion, fed by a stronger draft than it was designed to handle, surged in a way that sent a column of flame up the stovepipe that she could hear from across the room, a low building roar that was the sound of a fire deciding to become a larger fire. She crossed the room in 4 steps and damped the stove's air intake down to its minimum setting, which slowed the combustion, but the draw through the floor opening was still pulling more air into the firebox than the reduced intake could compensate for. She grabbed a handful of wet clay from the patch she kept near the front wall and pressed it over half the convection opening, reducing the cross-section, and the roar dropped to a growl, and the growl dropped to the steady breath of a properly fed fire. She sat beside the stove for the next 2 hours with her hand on the damper monitoring. The clay patch held overnight. In the morning, she replaced it with a precisely cut pine plug, beveled to fit snugly, that she could adjust by fraction of an inch by turning it. 3 nights of incremental adjustment, removing a sliver of pine monitoring, the combustion, adding it back, removing less monitoring again, produced the exact opening dimension she needed. The stove ran at its optimal temperature. The channel drew heat at a rate that dried the stored wood without creating a dangerous draft. The system settled into the quiet, self-regulating rhythm of something that has found its correct operating point. By the end of January, the wood in the channel was burning with a clean, hot intensity that bore no resemblance to the wet, smoking logs she had been fighting 2 weeks earlier. The smoke from the stovepipe, visible from outside, ran pale gray and nearly transparent, the signature of complete, efficient combustion. She was burning roughly half the wood she had originally budgeted for a comparable level of interior warmth, because the dugout's thermal mass meant she was maintaining 65 degrees with 2 short fires per day, rather than the continuous burning that frame houses required. The crisis arrived in the dark without announcement at 2 in the morning on the 22nd of January. She heard the knock on the door and was awake and upright before full consciousness had assembled itself, her hand finding the hammer by instinct in the dark. The temperature outside, when she cracked the door, hit her face like something solid, the specific quality of -18 degrees, which is cold enough that the air has a physical texture like breathing ground glass. Standing at the entrance in the lantern light, she held up against the dark, was a child of perhaps 8 years, a boy wearing a coat that was not adequate for the temperature, and boots she could see were soaked through at the ankles. His face showing the early signs of exposure, the waxy pallor around the nose and cheekbones that precedes the more serious manifestations. He told her through chattering teeth that made the words difficult to parse that his father had sent him. His father was James Alderton. They were out of dry wood. The stove in the main room had dropped to a temperature that was not warming the younger children. His father said, could she please help? She looked at this child for a moment, the wet boots, the inadequate coat, the 2 miles he had walked through -18 degrees at the direction of a man who had told her from the back of his horse that her engineering was primitive and her project was doomed. She thought about what it had cost Alderton to send his son to her door, instead of somewhere else, some more natural place, some neighbor whose help would not come with the weight of having been wrong. She thought about what it had cost this child to walk 2 miles in that cold. She opened the door fully and told the boy to come inside and stand by the stove. She loaded the hand sled she kept near the entrance with 4 days of wood from the channel vault, the driest and best cured pieces she had split, fine for quick ignition and split thick for sustained burning, and a balance of both because she knew what a cold house needed. She wrapped the boy's wet feet in a dry cloth from her supply and made him stand by the stove for 10 minutes before she allowed him back outside, and she walked alongside him the 2 miles to Alderton's farm, because she was not sending an 8-year-old back into -18 degrees alone. Alderton met her at his door. He was a large man, and the cold had made him look smaller. The inside of his frame house was 41 degrees, which she confirmed by the behavior of her breath inside the room. He looked at the sled and then at her, and something moved through his face that was not comfortable to look at, not shame exactly, because shame requires a certain amount of self-involvement, And what Alderton was feeling was larger and more impersonal than shame. It was the experience of having been entirely wrong about something that mattered, and having the evidence of that wrongness standing in his own front room in the form of a woman 30 years his senior who had just walked 2 miles in minus 18 degrees to keep his children from freezing. She did not say anything about being right. There was nothing to be gained from it, and she was not that kind of person anyway. She showed him how to lay the fire for maximum initial heat output and told him the wood on the sled would hold for 4 days and that she would have more available in 3 if he needed it. She left before he had assembled a response because the 2 miles back needed to be walked while the temperature was still where it was and not lower, and because the boy was warm now, and that was the whole point. Word traveled in the way of cold places where information about survival resources moves faster than any other category of news. By the 1st of February, Clara was supplying dry wood to 4 families in exchange for provisions. Alderton's family, a young couple named Marsh, whose husband had broken his wrist and couldn't work the woodpile, an elderly widow named Mrs. Beaumont, who had no one, and a carpenter named Hollis, who had burned through his supply in December during a week of unexpected extreme cold, and had been buying green wood from Boward at prices that were by any reasonable measure extortionate. The trades were precise and honest. She did not inflate the value of her wood to take advantage of desperation, though desperation would have supported any price she named. From Alderton, she received smoked meat, cornmeal, preserved beans, and a quantity of raw oats that represented more caloric value than 6 weeks of dishwashing wages. From the Marsh family, she received fabric and thread. From Mrs. Beaumont, who had nothing material to offer, she received 3 afternoons of company and a knowledge of herb preservation that Mrs. Beaumont had carried from Virginia 40 years earlier and had never had occasion to fully share. From Hollis, the carpenter, she received, after some negotiation, 4 days of skilled labor applied to a project of her choosing in the spring, a promissory note of the frontier kind that was worth exactly as much as the character of the man who issued it. And Hollis, whatever his failures of fuel management, had good character. The 5th exchange arrived in the form of Samuel Pratt himself, who appeared at her door on a morning in early February with nothing to offer except the same thing he had offered at the beginning work and the willingness to learn while he did it. His family's situation had not improved. His father was recovering slowly. The wheat seed for spring planting was in danger, and Samuel had spent the winter watching Clara build something from nothing, and had arrived at the understanding that what she was doing was not just survival engineering, but a teachable system, a body of knowledge that existed nowhere in print and was currently stored in a single 63-year-old woman who had arthritis and a bad back and would not live forever. He did not say all of this directly. He said, "I want to learn the drainage, the real engineering of it, not just the digging." He paused. "I think it matters, not just for one dugout." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she told him to come in and close the door. The deep freeze that defined the middle of the winter came on the night of February 8th. The temperature dropped to 22 below zero and held there for 11 days. The town of Morrow Crossing effectively froze in place. Agnes shut the dining hall for the first time in her ownership because the building could not maintain a working temperature above 45 degrees. Regardless of fuel expenditure, Bowers Lumberyard operated on reduced hours because the mill machinery seized in the cold, and 3 of the 4 conventional frame houses on the settlement's main street reported interior temperatures that hovered between 38 and 44 degrees, despite continuous stove operation and every blanket in the household deployed against the walls. In the dugout, the interior temperature never dropped below 61 degrees. She monitored it carefully, firing the stove twice daily at the same intervals, maintaining the same fuel discipline she had developed through January. The firewood in the channel vault burned with a dry, complete efficiency that produced clean heat and almost no ash accumulation, and the channel itself, the earth surrounding it at 8 feet of depth, maintaining its reliable 54-degree baseline, kept the stored wood from drawing any ambient moisture back from the surrounding soil. The system was self-sustaining in the way of things that have been correctly designed. It required attention, but not rescue management, but not emergency. Samuel spent 3 of the 11 cold days with her, sleeping on a pile of grain sacks near the stove, and she taught him the drainage engineering in detail during the hours when the cold outside made any other activity inadvisable. She drew the hydraulic principles in the clay of the floor with a stick, The grade calculations, the intersection angles of the drainage channels, the convection geometry of the firewood vault, the relationship between thermal mass and heating efficiency. He asked good questions, the kind that indicated he was not just memorizing but understanding, following the physics back to its causes rather than accepting the effects at face value. She had not expected to enjoy teaching. She discovered that she did specifically because of what it required: the discipline of making implicit knowledge, explicit the work of finding language for things she had known in her hands for so long that she had stopped knowing them in words. On the fourth day of the cold snap, Heinrich Bauer arrived at her door. He had walked from town 3 miles in -20 degrees, which told her something about the state of his fuel situation before he said a word. He stood at the entrance of the dugout, and she opened the door, and the wave of 65-degree air moved past her and hit him in the face, and she watched his expression go through several things in rapid succession: disbelief, recalculation, and something that was not quite humility, but was in the general direction of it. He looked past her into the dugout interior at the glowing stovepipe, the clean, dry walls, the channel cover running along the east floor, the organized and functional interior of a structure he had told her would rot and collapse and kill her. He came inside. He stood near the stove with his coat still on and looked at everything in the room with the eyes of a man who has spent 30 years building things and knows when he sees good engineering that he is seeing it. She gave him coffee because she had it and because the temperature had taken something out of him that coffee could partially restore. He wrapped both hands around the cup. "I need wood," he said. "My yard inventory is frozen solid and my shed stove won't hold temperature." He paused. "I'll pay a fair price." She told him the price: a specific quantity of premium hardware per 3 days of fuel delivery. He accepted without negotiation, which told her the desperation was real. But then he was quiet for a moment longer than the transaction required, looking at the floor channel cover, and she could see him doing the thing that engineers do when they encounter a solution they didn't think of: working backward through the logic to see how it had been arrived at, testing the reasoning against their own understanding of the physics. "The channel," he said. "It's a kiln. It uses the stove's waste heat to dry the stored wood and warm the floor on the return circuit," she confirmed. He looked at it for another long moment. Then, with the specific difficulty of a precise man acknowledging an error to a precise woman, "I was wrong about the rot." He set the coffee cup down. "I was wrong about the drainage. I built 19 houses in this territory, and I put drainage on the outside of every single one of them, and not one of them has drainage as good as what you built in that channel for 80 cents a pine." He looked at her directly for the first time since he had entered. "I want to talk to you about something. Not now, when the cold breaks." He left with the first wood delivery on his back. She watched him walk back toward town and turn back to her table and her coffee and the thing he had said about talking, which she filed in the part of her mind where she kept things that were not yet fully formed, but were growing. The 11 days of deep cold ended on the 19th of February. The temperature lifted to 5 above zero, which felt after 11 days of -22 like the beginning of something. Clara stood outside the dugout in the morning light and breathed air that did not freeze before it reached her lungs, and looked at the creek, which was still locked under its gray ice, and at the cottonwoods above the bank, which had endured the cold, the way old things endure hard winters, not by resisting, but by going deeply still and waiting. Samuel arrived that morning. She had been thinking about what he had said about the drainage, about it mattering beyond one dugout, and she had been thinking about Bauer, and about the conversation he had promised when the cold broke, and about the specific nature of what she had built, and what it meant that it had worked precisely as she had engineered it to work through the worst 11 days of the winter. She had been thinking about all of this in the quiet, lateral way she thought about problems that were still assembling themselves, not pushing toward conclusions, but letting the pieces find their positions. "When Bauer comes," she told Samuel, "I want you here." He looked at her with the focused attention he had been developing since December, the look of someone who has learned that when Clara told you to be somewhere, there was a specific reason, and it would become clear when it needed to. "When?" he asked. "Soon," she said. The cold had broken and spring was still 6 weeks away, and there was work enough in those 6 weeks to change if the next conversation went the way she thought it might. Everything about what the next decade of her life would look like. She picked up the draw knife and went to work on a piece of ash timber She had been shaping for a new shelf bracket, the left hand moving through its morning stiffness into something functional, the back reporting its usual complaint and receiving its usual response, which was neither resistance nor surrender, but the steady, non-negotiable insistence of a person who has decided that the work is the point and everything else is weather. Heinrich Bauer came on the first morning that the temperature held above zero for more than 4 consecutive hours, which was the 23rd of February, a Tuesday. He arrived on foot again, which Clara noted because a man of Bauer's position in Morro Crossing owned a horse and a sleigh and chose to walk 3 miles in late winter, cold only when he wanted the time to think before arriving. He knocked with the specific precision of a man who has decided exactly how hard to knock and no harder. And when she opened the door, he was standing with his hat in his hands in a gesture that was not natural to him and showed it. Samuel was at the table with a cup of coffee and the stick drawings of hydraulic grade calculations they had been reviewing, and he looked up when Bauer entered with the careful neutrality of a young man who has been told to be present and is taking the instructions seriously. Bauer acknowledged him with a nod that contained in its brevity a slight recalibration. He had expected to find Clara alone, and the presence of the younger man adjusted the tenor of what he had come to say in ways he was still working through when he sat down across the table. Clara poured him coffee and sat down and waited. She had found over 63 years that the best way to hear what a person had actually come to say was to say nothing yourself until they had navigated past everything they had come to say first. Bauer turned the coffee cup in his hands twice before he began. He had been thinking, he said, about a problem that cost him and every other merchant in Morro Crossing real money every single year, the kind of money that accumulated quietly and was easy to overlook in a good season and catastrophic in a bad one. Root vegetables froze in his storage shed between November and March. Seed grain lost viability when the temperature cycled repeatedly through freezing and thaw. Expensive hardware, iron fittings, leather goods, certain chemicals degraded in the temperature swings that a wooden shed in Dakota Territory experienced over the course of a full year. He had been accounting for spoilage losses of between 18 and 25% annually across his inventory for so long that he had stopped registering it as a solvable problem and had begun treating it as a fixed cost of doing business on the northern plains. He paused and looked at the east wall of the dugout at the floor channel cover, running its clean line from back corner to front entrance at the walls that showed no frost, no moisture, seepage, no cracking from thermal cycling. The interior temperature was 64 degrees on a February morning when the outside air was sitting at 3 above zero. He had known in the abstract what a properly engineered earth-sheltered structure could maintain in terms of thermal stability. He had not, until he had been standing in this room repeatedly over the past weeks, understood what that stability looked like in practice, the absence of the problems rather than the presence of a solution, which is how good engineering always announces itself. He proposed with the directness of a man who values his own time, a commercial storage facility built into the creek bank behind his lumberyard. Larger than the dugout, 20 feet wide, 30 feet deep, 12-foot ceiling at the entrance. He would finance all materials. He wanted Clara to serve as the lead engineer and supervise every aspect of the construction, applying the exact techniques she had developed here at this scale. He named a wage of $2 per week during the construction phase, which he presented as generous, which it was by the territory's standards, though not by the standards of what he was asking her to provide. Clara listened to all of this without expression. Then she said what she had decided she would say if the offer came in approximately this form, which she had anticipated it would. "I'll do it, but not for $2 a week and done." She looked at him directly. "I want the weekly wage during construction. I also want a permanent percentage of the gross storage fees once the facility is operating. And I retain the right to teach what I know to anyone I choose without your permission or restriction at any time." Bauer's expression moved through several things. The percentage was not something he had anticipated, and the teaching clause was not something he had considered at all, and both of them were, by the conventions of commercial arrangement in 1879, unusual to the point of being mildly radical. He asked what percentage. She named a number. He countered. She held for a moment, examining his counter against her internal assessment of what the facility would generate once it was operating, and then she accepted a figure between his counter and her original number, because the difference was small enough that fighting for it would cost goodwill worth more than the gap. But she did not move on the teaching clause, And when he pushed on it, not aggressively, but with the persistent probing of a man who considers all transferable knowledge to be a form of commercial property, she was entirely still in the way. She was still when she had decided something, and the decision was complete. The knowledge existed before I walked into your yard, she said. It came from my husband and from physics and from 40 years of watching how water moves and where heat goes. It doesn't belong to you because you're paying me to apply it. She paused. I've signed papers before that I should have read more carefully. I won't make that mistake again. Bauer looked at her for a long moment. Something settled in his expression, not defeat and not quite respect, but the specific adjustment of a man who has encountered a boundary that is not going to move and has decided to accept this as a feature of the terrain rather than an obstacle to be overcome. He extended his hand across the table. She shook it with her right hand, the one with the better grip, and the agreement was made. Samuel witnessed it without being asked to. She had not explained to him why she wanted him present, and he had not asked. But she saw in the steadiness of his attention that he had understood that watching a negotiation conducted on equal terms by someone who had every reason to accept less was its own category of instruction, and that she had known this when she told him to be there. They broke ground on the commercial storage facility on the 10th of March, 1879, 2 weeks after the negotiation and 4 days after the Hart Creek ice began to show the first gray softening that preceded the spring melt. The site Bauer had selected behind his lumberyard had a natural bank formation, not as clean as the Hart Creek bank, but adequate, the south face holding a reasonable solar aspect and the soil composition showing the dense clay-till mixture she needed. She walked the site for 2 hours before she approved it, pressing her palm against the exposed soil face, probing with a steel rod. Bauer's carpenter had ground to a point, measuring the drainage gradient of the surrounding terrain with a line level and a long straight board. The excavation required more than her body could provide, and she did not pretend otherwise. She directed. Samuel dug. She had hired him formally, not for wages she didn't yet have, but against the future storage percentage, a promissory arrangement she spelled out in writing because she had learned the specific value of written clarity and the specific cost of its absence. Hollis the carpenter, honoring the labor debt he had committed to in February, worked the rock courses of the front wall under her supervision, and his skilled hands made the work go at twice the speed her own had managed on the smaller structure. She stood at his shoulder and specified the angle of the wall, faced the mortar joint thickness, the placement of the drainage opening, and he executed with the quiet competence of a craftsman who recognizes good engineering in the instructions he's given. The scale difference was not merely quantitative. A structure 20 feet wide required a fundamentally different approach to roof load distribution than a 10-foot structure, and she spent 3 evenings in late March working through the arithmetic of the spanning poles. The diameter required the spacing interval, the cumulative dead load of 2 feet of saturated sod across a span nearly 3 times what the dugout had required. She made 2 full calculations and then made a third to check the second, because the consequence of an error at this scale was not a cracked wall she could repoint, but a catastrophic roof failure that could injure or kill someone inside. And the difference between those 2 outcomes was the difference between a problem and an ending. She increased the pole diameter requirement from 7 inches to 9 and decreased the spacing from 8 inches to 6. This added material cost and labor. And when she told Bauer, he absorbed the increase without objection, which told her that the cold had cost him more than she had fully appreciated and that he was not in a position to negotiate with physics. The spring thaw brought the first great test of the Hart Creek dugout simultaneously with the construction of the commercial facility, and the simultaneity was not coincidental. It was the reason she had agreed to Bauer's timing. She needed the spring melt to validate the drainage system at the original structure before she scaled it up, and she needed Bauer and anyone else watching to see the validation with their own eyes, rather than accepting her word for it. The melt began in earnest on the 28th of March. 5 days of temperatures in the upper 30s, combined with a series of rain events that turned the frozen creek valley into a moving system of water, seeking its level through every available path. Hart Creek rose from its normal 2-foot winter depth to just under 9 feet over 72 hours, the fastest rise in the 7 years that Alderton, who kept records, had been measuring it. The surrounding terrain shed snowmelt in visible sheets, the ground still frozen 6 inches down, and unable to absorb the volume, channeling everything toward the lowest points with the indifferent efficiency of gravity doing its oldest work. Clara sat inside the dugout on the evening of the 30th and listened to the creek. The water sound had changed register over the course of the day, moving from the quiet trickle of early melt to a sustained bass-frequency roar that she could feel in the soles of her feet through the earthen floor. Through the south window, she could see in the last of the afternoon light the creek surface running brown and fast at a height that put it within 30 yards of her entrance. The exterior drainage ditch she had cut the previous spring was running at full capacity, carrying the roof runoff and the bank seepage in a clean line away from the structure and down into the creek channel where it belonged. She took her lantern and walked the perimeter of the structure, checking the exterior drainage path, pressing her boot heel against the bank face above the roofline to test for saturation, examining the joint between the sod roof edge and the stone front wall, where water most commonly found its way into poorly built dugouts. The joints were holding. The sod had settled and compressed over the winter into a dense root-bound mat that shed water from its surface rather than absorbing it. The front wall showed no seepage at the mortar lines. The exterior ditch carried clean water, which meant the drainage was intercepting surface flow before it reached the structure rather than responding to water that had already infiltrated. She went back inside and made coffee and checked the interior channel. Dry. She ran her hand along the east wall at floor level and found one small area perhaps 4 inches across where a trace of moisture had worked through the clay, not a seep, not a flow, but the faint darkening of compacted earth that had absorbed what the drainage couldn't fully intercept. She covered it with a palm-sized piece of pine bark pressed into the wall, Face making a note to repoint that section with fresh mortar when conditions dried. Then she wiped the trace of moisture off the floor with a rag and cooked her dinner. James Alderton arrived the next morning while the creek was still running high. He came to the door with his hat in his hands, and she noticed that this was the posture men adopted when they had come to say something that cost them something, and she had been seeing it more frequently, and it never became easier to receive with complete equanimity because it always arrived carrying the weight of everything that had preceded it. He looked at the dugout at the drainage ditch running clear at the dry interior, visible through the open door, and then he looked at her. "My storage shed is 2 feet deep in water," he said. "Lost the seed grain I was keeping in there. About $40 worth." He was quiet for a moment. "Your drainage, the outside ditch, I want to understand how it works. Not because I'm building a dugout, because I want to run the same principle around my shed foundation before next spring." She spent an hour with him at the exterior drainage system, walking the full path of the ditch, from the roof line to the creek bank, explaining the grade, the intersection angles, the principle of intercepting water at the high point of its approach, rather than waiting for it to reach the structure. He listened with the concentrated attention of a man who has just paid $40 in ruined grain for his previous inattention to drainage, which is the most effective pedagogical motivation she had ever encountered. He asked 3 questions, all of them good, and she answered each one in full. When they were done, he looked at her with the expression she had been waiting without knowing she was waiting for it to see on his face for 4 months. It was not apology exactly. It was the specific expression of someone who has revised their understanding of another person completely and is aware of the distance between where they started and where they have arrived. "I told my boy this project would kill you," he said. "I told him that the night he walked back from your place in February." A pause that had weight in it. "I was wrong about more than the engineering." She accepted this the way she accepted accurate statements directly without performance. She told him the drainage principles worked on any structure if the grade was correct and the interception point was properly sited, and that she would walk his shed foundation with him in April when the ground had dried enough to dig. He thanked her and left, and she watched him go with the quiet, private satisfaction of someone who has stopped needing other people to be wrong and has started simply needing the work to be right. The commercial storage facility was completed on the 14th of May, 1879. It exceeded the original specifications in 2 respects. The ceiling height at the entrance reached 13 feet rather than 12 due to a natural concavity in the bank face that Clara incorporated into the design rather than cutting against, and the drainage network running along the interior walls was more complex than the Hart Creek model, a branching system of channels that covered the full perimeter of the floor and converged at a single exit point near the front entrance, with a removable silt trap she designed from a perforated pine box that Hollis built to her specification. The covered timber vault occupied the entire east wall, scaled up from the dugout original, with a convection system that used a dedicated small stove rather than the main heating stove to drive the wood drying circuit, which gave independent control of each function and eliminated the combustion surge problem she had solved by trial and error at the smaller scale. Bauer opened the facility to commercial clients in June. He charged 15 cents per week for a 4x4-foot storage block and secured 12 clients in the first month: merchants, farmers, a grain factor who traveled the territory buying and selling and needed stable storage at multiple points along his route. The elimination of freeze-thaw cycling meant that produce, seed, and dry goods stored in the facility maintained quality at a rate that no above-ground structure in the territory could match. A merchant named Gregson, who had been losing approximately 30% of his apple inventory to winter freeze damage annually, moved his full stock into the facility in October and retrieved it the following April with losses under 4%. He told 3 other merchants about this, and all 3 contracted for storage space the following season. Clara's percentage of the gross storage fees began generating income in July of 1879. The amount in the first month was $3.40. By October, when the facility was running at near full capacity with the approach of winter, her monthly share had reached $4.80. These were not large numbers in absolute terms, but they arrived without labor, which is the specific quality that distinguishes income from wages, and their arrival each month with the reliability of a physical law. The earth maintains its temperature, the drainage runs downhill, the storage fee generates its percentage, produced a kind of financial stability she had not experienced in 7 years of farming alone. She taught Samuel Pratt the complete engineering system over the summer and fall of 1879. In formal sessions she structured around the stages of construction on 2 additional dugouts she was consulting on for families in the territory, a young couple homesteading a stretch of land along the Cannonball River, and a retired Army farrier named Giddings, who wanted a storage structure for his smithing supplies. She charged $8 per consultation, which was less than she might have asked, and more than she felt she could justify without the track record to support it, and she delivered what the fee implied: complete engineering guidance from site selection through final drainage testing, with Samuel present at every stage and doing an increasing share of the technical communication as his understanding deepened. He was a good student in the specific way that made teaching worthwhile, not because he learned quickly, though he did, but because he asked why rather than just how. When she explained the wall angle, he asked why 10 degrees specifically and not 8 or 12, and she worked through the stress distribution geometry with him until he could derive the answer himself. When she explained the drainage grade, he asked what happened if the natural terrain didn't provide the necessary fall, and she showed him the workaround: the constructed grade, using compacted fill, the principles of artificial drainage that had the same hydraulic effect as natural slope. He was building piece by piece, not a copy of what she had done, but an understanding of why it worked, which meant he could apply it to situations she had never encountered and probably never would. Father Clemens appeared at her door in August of 1880 on a warm evening when the sun was still above the horizon and the cottonwoods above the bank were in full leaf. He was not alone. Samuel was with him, which she had not anticipated, and the combination of the 2 of them standing at her entrance told her something about the nature of the visit before anyone spoke. Father Clemens had aged visibly since the previous winter. The cold snap had taken something out of him that the summer had not fully restored, and he stood at her door with the careful physical economy of a man who has learned to conserve. He had come, he said, to ask directly for something he had not handled well indirectly, and he was not a man who found direct requests for forgiveness comfortable, but he had decided that comfort was not the point. He had told her in the autumn of 1878 that her project was a manifestation of pride, and that the Christian thing was to accept help from a position of humility rather than insist on a plan he considered dangerous. He had been wrong. Not about the danger. The winter had been genuinely dangerous, and he did not want to pretend otherwise, but about where the pride was located. He had looked at a 63-year-old woman with a specific and detailed engineering understanding and seen stubbornness. He had looked at someone who knew what she was doing and decided she couldn't possibly know what she was doing because of what she was. He looked at her steadily as he said this last part, which cost him something, and she received it steadily, which cost her something too. Then he said that Samuel had been speaking to him about the engineering principles, about the teaching Clara had been doing, and the structures being built across the territory, and that a young stonemason had recently arrived in the territory from Illinois, who was looking to develop his skills in foundation and drainage work. Father Clemens wanted to know if Clara would take him on, not as a laborer, as a student specifically of what she had developed. She looked at Father Clemens and then at Samuel and then back at Father Clemens. The request had the specific structure of an act of restitution. He was not offering money or apology, but something more durable, which was the acknowledgement that what she had built was worth transmitting, and that he wanted to be part of the transmission. She said she would meet the stonemason and make her own assessment, and that if he was serious, she would teach him what she knew. The stonemason's name was Robert Cade. He was 29, compact and quiet, with the specific patience of someone who has worked with stone and learned that stone sets the pace and you work with it or you work against it, and the second option always loses. He arrived at the Hart Creek dugout on a Monday morning and with no tools of his own, and the first thing Clara assessed was not his technical knowledge, but whether he would ask for what he needed or wait for someone to notice he didn't have it. He asked which was correct. She lent him a draw knife and a spade, and they started work. She taught Cade differently than she had taught Samuel. Samuel had learned by parallel construction, doing the work alongside her while she explained the principles. Cade learned by analysis, by studying what she had already built and working backward through the logic of each decision. She walked him through the Hart Creek dugout for 2 full days before he touched a tool, asking him to explain to her at each stage of the original construction why she had made the choice she had made. When he got it wrong, which he did repeatedly, in the first day she did not correct him immediately but asked him a question that pointed at the error and waited for him to find it himself. When he got it right, which he did with increasing frequency from the afternoon of the second day forward, she said nothing except correct and moved to the next element. Cade built a dugout along the Hart River that autumn, his first independent project under her consultation. It was not perfect. The front wall courses showed a slight variation in mortar joint thickness that she would not have tolerated in her own work, but that fell within the functional tolerance, but the drainage system was precise. The roof load calculation was conservative in the right direction, and the convection channel geometry was exact. She walked through it at completion and ran her hand along the east wall at floor level and found it dry, and she told him it would hold, and it did. The financial accounting of the years between 1879 and 1882 was not the story of sudden wealth. It was the story of small, reliable surpluses accumulating with the patience of interest compounding in a bank, the storage percentage, the consultation fees, the trades that continued through a second winter, and a third, the gradual reduction of what she owed and the gradual increase of what she held. She kept the accounting in a small leather notebook, every transaction recorded to the cent, because the notebook was the evidence that what she was doing was real and that the numbers were moving in the right direction. And on the mornings when her back was bad and her hand was slow and the February light was thin and gray, and the entire enterprise seemed built on a foundation of stubbornness rather than sense. She opened the notebook and read the columns, and the columns told her the truth independently of how she felt. By the spring of 1882, the tin box held $112. The Homestead Act allowed a filing on 80 acres at $1.25 per acre for a total of $100, leaving $12 for the filing fee and incidentals. She walked to the county land office in Morrow Crossing on the 4th of April, 1882, and filed the claim on the 80 acres surrounding the original Hart Creek dugout site, the acres that included the south-facing bank, the cottonwood grove above it, the drainage path down to the creek, and the 3 miles of creek bottom that Elias had shown her in 1869, and said in the plain language of a man who understood value that this was the piece worth keeping. The county clerk stamped the certificate and slid it across the counter, and she picked it up with her right hand, the hand with the better grip, and looked at her own name on it. Clara May Whitfield, landowner, 80 acres, Hart County, Dakota Territory. She had come to this office 3.5 years earlier with $6.40 and a hammer, in the memory of a conversation her dead husband had once had on a summer afternoon beside a creek. She stood at the counter and felt the weight of the certificate paper nearly weightless, and also the heaviest thing she had held in years, and she thought about the county poorhouse 12 miles east, about the common room where the man had stared at the wall, about the specific nature of what is lost when a person stops being the author of their own days. She folded the certificate carefully and put it in her coat pocket and walked out into the April morning. The fullness of what had been built arrived not as a dramatic event, but as something quieter and more total an afternoon in October of 1882, when Clara walked the territory with Samuel Pratt and counted what had been built. 14 earth-sheltered structures, all of them applying the principles she had developed at Hart Creek, in that first terrible winter, scattered across the Dakota landscape like a quiet argument made in earth and clay and cottonwood timber. Not one had flooded. Not one had collapsed. Not one had failed to maintain thermal stability through the winters that had followed, two of which had been by the measurement of the men who kept temperature records among the coldest in the territory's documented history. She walked with Samuel through the afternoon light that October, the cottonwoods above the creek showing their fall yellow, the creek itself running at its normal level. After the summer rains, the dugout roof thick with the second year's grass growth and nearly invisible from 20 yards away. Just a slight rise in the landscape that you might walk past without knowing it was a home, a warm and dry and functional home that had cost less than $10 and had held against everything the territory had thrown at it for 4 years. Samuel was quiet for most of the walk. He had become in 3 years of teaching something that she had not fully anticipated when she agreed to the arrangement, not just a competent practitioner of the engineering, but a person who understood it well enough to extend it to apply it to situations she had not encountered, to solve problems that arose in new configurations using the principles rather than the specific solutions. He stopped at the edge of the bank above the dugout and looked out over the creek valley. And then he said something that she did not expect. "You know, what you built isn't just the 14 structures." He paused. "It's me and Cade and whoever we teach after this." He looked at her. "The structures will stand as long as they stand. The principles don't have an ending." She stood beside him and looked at the creek and the cottonwoods and the pale October sky, and she felt the accuracy of what he had said settle into her, the way accurate things settle, not with the drama of revelation, but with the quiet of recognition, as if she had known it and simply needed to hear it said aloud to understand that she had known it. The knowledge she carried was not hers in the sense of possession. It had come from Elias, who had gotten it from his father, and from 40 years of building, and it had come from physics, which belonged to no one, and it had come from the specific education of necessity from a winter that would have killed her if she hadn't understood exactly what was required. It was hers to use and hers to give, and the giving did not diminish it. That was the nature of engineering and knowledge, and perhaps of all knowledge, and she had been practicing this truth for 3 years without naming it. Douglas Whitfield reappeared in the territory in the summer of 1883. She learned of his presence through Agnes, who learned of it through the network of information that moved through her dining hall counter, the way water moves through good drainage reliably in the direction of the lowest point, ending up where it needed to be. Douglas had returned from whatever enterprise had taken him after the eviction, and he had heard about the storage facility, and the consultation work, and the 80 acres, and he had told someone that he intended to speak with Clara about certain arrangements. Agnes reported this to Clara with the specific expression of someone who is conveying information they expect to be acted upon. Clara listened and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "If he comes, he's welcome to come." She paused. "I have nothing he can take." And this was true in a way it had never been true during the 22 years she had spent on the farm he had eventually claimed, not because she lacked things worth taking, but because what she had now was built on a foundation that could not be transferred by signature or seized by legal instrument. The knowledge was in her hands, and in Samuel's hands, and in Cade's hands, and in the hands of the families who had learned the drainage principles from her consultations. The land was in her name alone, purchased with money she had generated herself, recorded in the county office under a stamp she had watched the clerk apply. Douglas did not come. Father Clemens died in the winter of 1884 of the same pneumonia that had taken Elias 13 years earlier. He died in his own house with adequate warmth, the drainage modifications he had made to his foundation the previous spring, having saved his cellar stores from the fall flooding that had damaged several other properties in the settlement. Clara attended the funeral and stood at the back of his church and thought about the conversation they had on the frozen road after Mass in November of 1878, and about the conversation on her doorstep in the summer of 1880, and about the specific distance between those two conversations measured not in time but in the willingness to be wrong. She thought that of all the revisions she had witnessed in the people around her, his had cost him the most and had been the most completely made, and she respected that, without sentimentality, and without the need to say it aloud to anyone. In the spring of 1885, she called Samuel to the dugout and told him she wanted to transfer the formal consultation work to him. Not because she was not done, she would never be entirely done. The habit of solving problems with the tools available was by this point simply how her mind operated, and she doubted it would stop before she did. But her hands were giving her increasing trouble in the cold months. The left hand had moved past arthritis into something that made the fine motor work of technical drawing unreliable. The line wavering when she needed it steady, the measurements sometimes coming off the page at fractions that she could feel were wrong, but could not always correct on the first attempt. She could still walk a site and read it and direct everything that happened on it. She could still teach. She could not always hold the pencil the way the work required. She told him this directly, as she told all difficult things, not as a confession of defeat, but as a fact requiring a response. He was 30 years old. He had built or consulted on 11 structures in the 3 years since she had begun his formal instruction. His work was sound and getting sounder, and he had recently begun developing a modified drainage channel configuration for sites with lateral, rather than frontal water approach that she had reviewed and found technically correct and practically elegant. He was ready, and they both knew it, and the knowledge of it sat between them as a comfortable weight rather than a sharp one. He asked if she would still review his work. She told him she would review anything he brought to her as long as she was capable of reading a site drawing, which she expected to be for some years yet. He accepted this, and they shook hands across the table, and the handshake had the specific gravity of a transfer, not of ownership, which was not how she thought about knowledge, but of primary responsibility, which was different. Agnes Norris closed the dining hall in 1886, not from failure, but from completion. She had made enough money over 20 years to buy a house in a larger settlement to the east where her daughter had moved, and she left Morrow Crossing in April with the specific lightness of someone whose work is genuinely finished, rather than simply stopped. She and Clara said their goodbyes on the morning Agnes's wagon loaded, and the goodbye was not long because long goodbyes were not the language of either of them. Agnes pressed Clara's right hand in both of hers and said, "I never thought it would work." She paused, and the pause had something in it that was older than the dugout and older than the winter of 1878. "I'm glad I was wrong." Clara watched the wagon move north along the frozen road until it turned at the settlement boundary and disappeared, and then she walked back to the dugout in the early morning light, the Hart Creek ice beginning to show the first gray softening of the approaching spring, the cottonwoods above the bank standing in the particular stillness of late winter trees that have survived another season and are simply waiting for the instruction to leaf. The dugout roof was thick with the sixth year's grass growth, the exterior drainage ditch worn smooth and deep by 6 springs of carrying snowmelt away from the foundation, the south-facing window catching the low morning sun and throwing a narrow rectangle of light against the east wall. She opened the door and went inside and made coffee and sat at the table she had built from scrap lumber in the first months and looked at the east wall where the floor channel ran its clean line from back corner to entrance. The pine board cover, worn smooth by years of walking. The whole construction, so familiar by now, that she stopped seeing it the way you stop seeing the walls of the room you have lived in longest. She took the leather notebook from the shelf above the table and opened it to the current page and wrote the date at the top of a new entry and recorded the morning temperature, which was 54 degrees inside and 12 below zero outside, which was the same differential it had been on the first morning she had woken in this structure in December of 1878, the same differential it had been every cold morning for 6 years, as reliable and indifferent as the law that produced it. The notebook contained, by this point, 6 years of daily temperature records, every financial transaction she had conducted since November of 1878, the dimensions and drainage specifications of all 14 structures she had designed or consulted on, and in the back pages, written in the careful hand she used for things she wanted to be legible. To someone else, a set of engineering principles distilled from everything she had learned and tested and corrected over those 6 years. Not a manual exactly, she had no formal engineering training, and she was not going to pretend to write like someone who did. More like a field guide, the kind of document that described not just what to do, but why, so that a person reading it without access to her could still understand the logic well enough to apply it to a situation she had never encountered. She had been adding to the back pages since the previous winter. She had not told Samuel about it yet, though she intended to, and she had not told anyone else because it was not finished, and she did not show unfinished work. But it was close. Another month of writing, perhaps two, and the principles would be there in full: the grade calculations, the thermal mass theory, the drainage network, geometry, the materials testing for natural fiber composite mortar, the convection channel design, and the sizing formula she had derived through the trial and error of that first January. Everything that existed in her hands and in her understanding transferred to paper, where it would survive her and go on doing its work in the world without her. She closed the notebook and sat for a moment in the morning quiet of a room that was 54 degrees when the world outside was 12 below zero. In the spring, she would walk the Hart Creek bank again, as she did every spring, checking the drainage ditch in the roof and the front wall mortar lines, making the small corrections that time required, maintaining the conversation with the structure that she had been maintaining for 6 years. The 80 acres were hers, and the knowledge was hers, and the notebook was filling. And outside, the cottonwoods were waiting for spring with the patience of old things that have learned to wait well. There was no one watching. There was no monument and no ceremony, and no one to deliver a speech about what had been built. There was just the morning light on the east wall and the coffee going cold on the table and the sound of Hart Creek moving under its ice somewhere below the bank. The water finding its level through every available path, doing what water had always done long before she arrived, and would continue doing long after she was gone, patient, precise, entirely indifferent to the opinion of anyone who thought it should go some other way. She picked up her pencil and opened the notebook to the back pages and found her place and kept writing.